afternoon. I guess I'll just start by saying that this is actually a work that's taken me about 5 years to finish. Mostly because I formulated this during my undergrad years and promptly shelved it for a greater part of 4.5 years, and basically just revived it a few months ago and finished it. So, for those of you who didn't know, Bataan is a region in Region 3, and it is a peninsula being a landmass connected to a much larger landmass and surrounded in 3 parts by water. Now, since a peninsula only has one connection to a larger landmass, which in this case, the larger part of Luzon, this implies a unitary flow of diversity from the larger Luzon landmass up to the Bataan Peninsula, creating an almost pseudo-isolation for a number of fauna and flora in the region. Now, the main setting of my study was in the Bataan Natural Park, or Bataan National Park. It's basically a 88 hectares of forest and mountains found in the Bataan region. It is a protected area by our government, and it comprises a number of municipalities, including Hermosa, Orani, Saman, Abubay, Balanga, Oga, and Morong. Now, the Bataan Natural Park is not strictly limited to the Bataan region, though much of it comprises of Mount Natib, the main mountain of Bataan. Parts of it are actually derived from the Subic Bay Forest Reserve, which that piece of fact you will find out a lot more later. Now, this is a map. This is a topographical map of Mount Natib. Mount Natib is an andesitic dormant stratovolcano, and it lies in the western Bataan lineament. It covers most of northern Bataan. Now, the unique feature of Mount Natib is that it is actually not just one volcano. It's actually 2 volcanoes, and these 2 volcanoes comprises the Natib caldera system, because these 2 volcanoes are fused together due to past events. Actually, the first volcano, the first caldera is the old caldera, the larger one, and the second caldera is the Pasukulan caldera, which is the smaller one. Now, the size of these calderas are a testament to the effects of the volcanic activity that have occurred forming this mountain. Basically, the old caldera was formed from an eruption which is far more stronger than the 1981 Natubo eruption. And this formed a very large crater that was promptly became colonized by the surrounding forest and has become the Mount Natib that is today. The Pasukulan caldera, on the other hand, is the latest and the youngest of the 2 calderas. Its formation was more nearer to the intensity of the Natubo eruption. Now, the formation of these caldera formed a number of habitat types within the area. But contemporarily, most of these areas have become deforested, denuded, and disturbed due to the encroaching presence of human settlements. So a number of habitats such as grasslands and agroforests, as well as disturbed secondary forests, are a common sight in the periphery of Mount Natib. However, as you go inwards into the interior of the caldera, as well as you go higher, you'll encounter more specialized habitats that best exemplify the previous aspects of the mountains. For example, a secondary forest found inside the caldera, an undisturbed high elevation forest, as well as cloud forests comprised of mossy and montane forests. Now, as far as herpetofaunal work in Bataan is concerned, there are actually very few works conducted within the area. In fact, from my research at the PNLO office in Bataan, there are actually just 2 data sets, which comprises the entirety of the herpetofaunal surveys in Bataan. The first one was actually a compilation of species count from the works of various biologists from 1986 to 1997. And this exemplified the first count, the first full listing of Herpetofauna within the area. Prominently, the data that I later show you comprises from the works of Dr. Angel Alcala during his field work for the Guide of Philippine Flora and Fauna, as well as the work of Dr. C. Cox, whose work focused on the conservation status of the biological resources of the Philippines. Now, this list, as I said, is rudimentary simply because a number of it is unverified. Furthermore, this list comprises not just the Bataan Natural Park, but also parts of Subic, implying that some of these species are actually mirrors the one found in the forests of Subic as well as of Zambales. The second set of data is actually more contemporary. In this case, a survey made in last year, 2015, by Dr. Arvin Jesmos under the Invasive Alien Species Project. Now, although this was a complete survey, it was not a journal study, but more of a field report. And much of Dr. Jesmos's, the results of Dr. Jesmos' survey found a number of species which were previously not included in the first set of data. Furthermore, it also was the first study to document the distribution of Platymantis montanus and Hemiphytodactylus typhus in Bataan. So his listing of 22 species formed the base of the second list of species for Bataan, comprising of 9 frog species, 7 lizard species, and 6 snake species. It is exemplified in his survey that no alien species were found in the sites that no invasive species were found in the sites where he conducted his survey. Now, the premise of both studies is that the number of studies for Herpetofauna Bataan is largely few and scattered. So my study aims to establish a baseline for future herpetofaunal surveys in Mount Natib, to establish key sites of interest in the Bataan Natural Park, and finally to compile and update all the pre-existing data on herpetofauna and produce a competent and much more complete species inventory in the case of Mount Natib. I established 5 sites in the Orani and the Agupay phase of Mount Natib, 3 sites in the higher elevation, and 2 sites in the lower elevations of Agupay. Sites 1 to 3 basically is the Orani phase of Mount Natib, and much of the work there focused on an area called Bagkyas, while site 5 and 4 focus on an area in Agupay near the Bangkal human settlements bordering the mountain. I picked these sites in regards to a varied difference in habitat types. For example, site 1 is a transition area between grassland and semi-disturbed areas. These areas are dominated by saplings and grasses, and it represents a marked change before the appearance of the undisturbed secondary forests. Now, this extends from a place known as the View Deck in one part of Rani and extends up to the Bagkyas Dam, bordering the Bagkyas base camp. The second site is a cloud forest extending up to 900 to more than 1,000 meters above sea level, and it's largely dominated by montane and mossy forests with giant ferns, and includes an open grassland dominated by fallen bamboo and thick saplings. Now, although it was not part of the eventual transit that I would form, I included Natib Peak, which was adjacent to the second site of Peak, as part of our opportunistic sampling. The third site is a forest interior, around 600 to 700 meters above sea level, relatively undisturbed. It is moderately abundant with saplings and bitter-carp trees. The fourth site is a buffer zone in the Bataan settlement and the Bagyas boundary, and it represents a forest edge type of environment with moderate disturbance. The final site is a highly disturbed stream and forest site, which is also a forest rehabilitated area in the Bataan settlements. The elevation is the lowest of the five, 290 to 360 meters above sea level, and a marked characteristic of the area is the presence of orchard and coconut trees. The survey techniques I used for this study is a time encountered survey, basically a nocturnal survey involving a 1 kilometer transit per site, which lasts from 6 to 9 a.m. or more in some cases, opportunistic survey or diurnal surveys, and secondary species account from local and park personnel. I also collected some voucher specimens for collection, and I also collected tissue samples, basically liver samples, and stored them in 99.9% ethanol for later molecular studies. Now, the results of my study documented 29 species of reptiles and amphibians. A large chunk of that focused on amphibians because during the time of my study, the weather was mostly rainy, and reptile encounters were much more harder than amphibian encounters. Now, so this is my summary of the Herpetofauna found in Mount Natib, and this basically summarizes 3 points that I like to surmise: the endemicity of each species, the presence and absence of each species in each type of habitat on 5 sites, as well as their conservation status. I also exemplified the conservation status of those species which are near threatened and vulnerable. So what I want you to see here, basically, is that some species do occur more frequently are limited to some sites rather than others. For example, the aforementioned Platymantis montanus was only found in one site, specifically in the Natib Peak in Site 2. So no other place in the region did we find any other specimens of Platymantis montanus. And the same goes with some species of snakes like the Oligodon, which was found more on the grassland areas bordering Orani. Now, the herpetofauna endemicity of the area was computed to be about 55.10%, which suggests that Mount Natib and the Bataan Natural Park is indeed one of the hotspots of biodiversity within the area, very much like its neighbor, the Zambales Massif, which is the closest geographic neighbor of Bataan. Now, although the species account of my survey was much lower than those compared to other surveys, it is my hope that further intensive work in the mountain may yield an increased species encounter eventually. Is that the presence of invasive species, we recall from the previous table, all coincided on heavily disturbed areas in Site 5, low elevation disturbed areas, and were markedly absent in the higher elevation, more than 600 meters above sea level. Now, this absence is indicative of the role of the mountain as barrier to the progression of invasive species to much higher and much more isolated parts of the mountain. Now, the reason why I included the conservation status in this case is for me to address the number of species within the area that are either threatened or vulnerable in terms of their conservation status. Now, a large chunk of that is of least concern, but it is well to note that 27.58% of the species were found to have the aforementioned conservation status. Now, although this appears small, when one takes into account the size of the mountain as well as the number of deforested areas within the mountain, within the periphery of the mountain, this implies that the number of sites that need to be conserved and protected are basically limited to the higher elevations rather than to the lower elevation. Furthermore, this implies that highly specialized species with specific habitat requirements become easily affected by disturbance when human encroachment appears within an area. For example, among the 4 ceratobatrachid species identified, the bottom two, Platymantis mimulus and Platymantis montanus, are both limited to high elevation areas, particularly Platymantis montanus, which was found at the Natib Creek, and Platymantis mimulus, which was found at 800 to 900 meters above sea level. Below that, none of the two species were to be found. But Platymantis corrugatus and Platymantis dorsalis was present in a number of greater areas in the mountain compared to the other two. The same could be said for a number of panic frogs, with the Luzon panic frog or Lunonitis panocephalus suffering from a near threatened to almost vulnerable conservation status due to overhunting by locals and indigenous people. In contrast to the distribution of the Woodward's pine frog, which is more adaptive, and that is not even mentioning the presence of the Chinese edible frog or Huckleback in the lower elevation areas. Now, not all frog species are with near threatened or vulnerable status necessarily have to be found in stream systems. The Calula calinensis is near threatened because of its natural habitat being trees. And the more deforested trees that occurs around an area, the lesser the potential nesting sites that the Calula will be able to find. In contrast, on the other hand, more adaptive species like the common tree frog, Polypedates, much able to traverse through different types of habitats with low detrimental effect to its population. Among ranids, the variable-backed frog, or Hylarana similis, also suffers from a near-threatened status, in contrast to the more adaptive Cytozyga and Hylarana erythrea. In contrast to amphibia, reptiles are much more adaptive due to their increased mobility and less dependence to water. For this reason, a number of the reptile species identified by the study has at least concern for conservation status, say for a few number 6. This includes the family of agamids, the flying lizards, and the crested lizards, the gecko species found in a number of human settlements as well as high elevation areas, the monitor lizards, and a number of snakes. Although special mention should be made for one specific snake, the Oligodon acros, the northern-headed snake, which has a vulnerable conservation status due to its specialized forest and grassland habitats. In terms of elaphid and viperiid, both are remarkably of least concern, due mostly for the part of the barred coral snake being adapted to a number of different environments, and due to the Philippine viper inhabiting both high and low elevation forests within the mountain. The final species that has, perhaps one of the only two species which suffer from a vulnerable conservation status, is the Amboina boxer or Fauna amborensis, which is highly collected and sold as pets. And due to this, their number has decreased steadily over the years. So, knowing these things and compiling this with the number of the previous studies I have collated together, I'm able now to form a singular species account of 49 species occurring in Mount Natib and its surrounding area. Majority of this still are frogs, followed by lizards, then snakes, and turtles. And this list is something I hope would become a baseline as well as a reference for any future herpetofaunal field work within Mount Natib and the Bataan Natural Park. So, basically my study wishes to emphasize that the role that Mount Natib plays within the Bataan Peninsula is both an important and is an important one, despite its status as a protected area which has been denuded but eventually rehabilitated. This allows for the monitoring. This study hopes to allow for monitoring of disturbance within and outside of the park, and as well as facilitate on careful regulations by park personnel to promote increased efforts by the local community to maintain and rehabilitate the mountain, and also to protect local fauna and flora from excessive hunting. In conclusion, the abundance and endemicity of Herpetofauna in Mount Natib belies its value as both a peninsular mountain as well as a core area of biodiversity within the region. This study stresses the necessity for increased herpetofaunal work in local mountains in Luzon, as well as more extensive fieldworks in the Bataan Natural Park. A better understanding of the local system will be an aid to the rehabilitation and conservation of the mountain and its eventual inhabitants for future studies. So, that's all.